Brought to you by Williams. We make clean energy happen.
I'm Yasmin Gagne.
I'm Josh Christensen.
And this is Most Innovative Companies. On today's episode, Fast Company contributing writer Chris Stokel-Walker.
What isn't best for consumers, I think, is OpenAI getting away with it again.
Senior editor and author of An Exercise in Uncertainty, Jon Gluck.
I write in the book that cancer is a nuclear bomb, not a tactical weapon, in the sense that it has fallout across all areas of your life.
And as always, keeping tabs.
My dumb take is that robotaxis aren't actually going to take off because people secretly want dangerous drivers.
But first, here's the download, the news you need to know this week in the world of business and innovation.
The conflict with Iran escalated and then de-escalated over the weekend. First, the U.S. launched an attack on 3 nuclear facilities in Iran. Then, Iran responded with a retaliatory strike on a U.S. military base in Qatar. And finally, President Trump announced a ceasefire, which seemed to have been violated by both Iran and Israel in the initial hours after Trump's truth denouncement. But for now, the ceasefire holds. And markets have responded in kind with gains made across major indexes so far this week.
In a stunning upset for establishment Democrats, 33-year-old Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani is poised to secure the party nomination for New York mayor after the concession of former Governor Andrew Cuomo. Mamdani, who currently serves as a member of the New York State Assembly for Queens, ran on a platform emphasizing affordability in a famously unaffordable city, proposing such programs as universal childcare, freezing the rent in rent-stabilized apartments, and free city buses. Cuomo, who resigned the governorship in 2021 after being accused of sexual harassment by 13 women, has not yet ruled out continuing his run on an independent line. What a crazy few days. I wonder how the heat affected voter turnout.
I don't know. Probably not great for Cuomo. I mean, nothing seemed to go well for Cuomo.
Also, a lot of his supporters are probably in the Hamptons.
They probably are. Turnout was really high, though.
Damn.
We're still with the heat.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, there was energy. My favorite joke du jour on social media right now is that Mamdani won thanks to white guys who say inshallah.
It's true, though.
It really is. On Tuesday, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell said that the central bank would continue to hold steady on interest rates given the strength of the labor market, elevated inflation, and incoming pressure on prices due to the Trump administration's tariffs. And if you think you're listening to an episode of this podcast from a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago, don't adjust your dial. We've been saying this every month for a while now, every time inflation daddy Jerome Powell comes out and doesn't move interest rates. The move has angered President Trump, shocker, shocker, who repeated his threats of firing Mr. Powell in recent days and called for cuts by the Fed to the tune of 2.5%.
Tesla rolled out its first highly anticipated robotaxis in Austin, Texas this past weekend. The first passengers included both Tesla investors and social media influencers who were accompanied by human observers in the passenger seats of the autonomous vehicles. The robotaxi rides are taking place in Tesla's Model Y vehicles rather than the Cybercab, which is still in the works and not expected to be released for a few years.
And finally, dating app Bumble announced a layoff of about 240 roles, roughly 30% of its total workforce. This comes after layoffs to around the same percent last year. The staffing reduction is expected to save the company about $40 million annually, which Bumble says it will invest into technology and product developments. Investors received the news positively, with shares in the dating app jumping 26% on Wednesday. And if you want to know more about this, we had an episode a few weeks ago on this, and Yaz has also written quite a bit about dating apps, so go check out her writing and that episode.
And that's the news you need to know today. So, Josh, it is so hot in New York. I am fortunate to be broadcasting from London. How are you beating the heat?
I'm not. I'm failing. I'm failing at beating the heat so bad. I'm famously a sweaty man. Maybe not famously. Maybe that's not the right word for it. Man, I don't do well in the heat in New York, and it's real rough. I just crank my AC as low as I possibly can in my apartment. And
you mean as high? Well, yeah, I guess it's low.
I guess it's low. Could be high. It depends on, I don't know. I'm
how
more
you
of a
think
glass.
about it. Yeah.
It depends. I'm a cynical guy, so I guess I'm turning it low and not turning it high. Oh, God, but it's rough. I do not look forward to going home tonight.
Me and Lou were trying to save money and walk from my apartment to Atlantic Avenue to take the train to JFK on Sunday when it was very hot.
Oh, hell no.
And it was just like a 15, 20-minute walk for us. And we made it a block and then called an Uber.
You absolutely can't, especially not with
do this.
suitcases.
No,
You can't do that.
we were carrying so much shit.
Ugh, awful. Just
Miserable.
awful. Well, that's enough talking about the heat in New York City. We got to talk about the heat between two tech giants. Transition.
OpenAI and Microsoft have enjoyed something of a symbiotic partnership for the past 6 years since Microsoft invested in OpenAI, and OpenAI basically created the AI boom when it released groundbreaking AI chatbot ChatGPT. But now their partnership is at a crossroads. The two companies may be putting forth a united front for the press, but behind the scenes, tensions are high, with disagreements over intellectual property, profit sharing, and even the future of OpenAI's structure. Here to break it down for us is Fast Company contributing writer Chris Stokel-Walker and senior staff editor Max Ufberg. So, Chris, give us the rundown on the history of Microsoft's partnership with OpenAI and how it's evolved over the past 6 years.
Yeah, it's been incredibly long, and actually it goes back even more than 6 years. We can take it back, I suppose, to 2016, 1 year after OpenAI was launched at an academic conference by Sam Altman and Elon Musk, that guy that we all know and love now. But basically, a year after OpenAI was founded, the company was kind of struggling a little bit. They had these grand plans to develop these super powerful AI models, but they did not have the computing power to do so. So Microsoft kind of rode to the rescue, said, you know what, we will help you out. We will broker a deal with you where we have an exclusive partnership for us to supply your computing power through our Microsoft Azure servers. And we want you to do that. And OpenAI, of course, at the time, really very much bootstrapped, really struggling to try and figure this out. So they agreed to that. Fast forward 3 years to 2019. They then try to shift into kind of a non-profit, which is how they started, to a capped profit model for their business. OpenAI's profit or seeking profit has always been a bit of a challenge over the last several years and a big bone of contention in the tech world, at which point Microsoft comes in with $1 billion of investment. Now, that wasn't really in cash, yes. That was actually in yet more credits for that cloud compute, which was kind of a little bit of an IOU, but it still tied up the two companies even closer together. And then in the time since then, obviously, we have had the ChatGPT revolution, Microsoft realizing that this is going to be a massive thing, and OpenAI is a world-leading company, investing ultimately over kind of $10 billion into the firm in exchange for around about half of OpenAI's profits, capped at around about 10% of their investment. Now, Sam Altman is a smart businessman, doesn't want to give over more than half, so it is actually 49%. But it does mean there is this kind of simultaneously comfortable but also slightly uneasy relationship between the two.
Do you have a sense of who at Microsoft saw this early potential? Like, I know Satya is obviously credited with, the partnership because it was under his watch, but what did Microsoft see in 2016?
I think that they saw a company that was backed by a guy at the time who was seen as kind of a real mensch in terms of his tech knowledge, which was Elon Musk. And they saw a guy who had a proven track record in building companies and growing companies. I think that is the most important thing. Sam Altman, of course, kind of has a long history as Y Combinator, hadn't necessarily had huge success with his own firms, but he was basically making a big bet on this technology. And it can be hard to remember, but actually kind of 2015, 2016 time, we were making good strides, but we weren't quite at this kind of stratospheric growth phase that we've been post-ChatGPT. So it was still a bit of a gamble. But I think people within Microsoft, and I know Bill Gates has changed his tune a little bit on this in the same way that he changed his tune on the internet in the early 90s, wasn't super keen on the idea of AI. But I think that they did have champions within Microsoft to say, you know what, actually, this is a bet worth taking. And ultimately, we provide compute already. So it doesn't matter if it's not that much of a cost to us.
I would also just highlight Kevin Scott, Microsoft CTO, was an early champion. I think he, in, I want to say 2019, was internally, lobbying to make those billion-dollar investments, and definitely was, had Satya's ear.
So what are some of the specific stipulations of the agreement between OpenAI and Microsoft?
Yeah, so we have at its core, I guess, that kind of 49-51 split, which is obviously in favor of OpenAI. I guess also in exchange of that, you had until relatively recently, around about January this year, Microsoft were the exclusive provider of cloud compute for OpenAI, which meant that they were kind of handling all of that ChatGPT traffic.
But now they're no longer, right?
Exactly. So now, since January, there's kind of been a free-for-all, and OpenAI has done a load of deals with different places, Oracle, Google, it's rumored, which is quite a big deal, actually, because they are kind of like super big competition, right? You have Gemini trying to breathe down the neck of ChatGPT and being unable to.
How did they manage to renegotiate that agreement?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it was basically time limited by our understanding, where actually this was kind of like a finite deal. And they said, this is the point at which our exclusivity ends. I mean, the other thing also to point out is that like there has been a little bit of tension for a while now. Part of the deal is that basically grandfathered into the agreement by our understanding is that Microsoft gets access to pretty much all of OpenAI's tech, not just the stuff that OpenAI has previously developed at the point of those agreements, but anything that comes in afterwards, which I think is kind of what has led us up to this present conflict.
So OpenAI has sort of been floating this idea that if Microsoft doesn't have access to Windsurf, given that it already owns GitHub, it would be better for them. Explain what that means for people like me who don't.
Yeah.
That just sounds like a bunch of words.
Yeah. Well, it kind of is. I mean, like it's kind of like an LLM just spewed it out, right? I mean, this is the challenge that we have. We all use LLMs in some shape or form, or increasing numbers of us are now. We use them for different tasks. I think one of the ones that is seen as the highest return is the development of code. And so for Microsoft, that means that using Copilot is a brilliant way that they can try and get their product in front of millions of developers' eyeballs. The problem is that is powered by kind of OpenAI tech, but isn't necessarily fantastic. I mean, it's good, don't get me wrong. It's better than my coding knowledge. I am awful at that, although I am a little bit of a vibe coder over the last few months. So we had Copilot, which is okay, but not great. And there is a space into the market for competitors there. Because Copilot is decent, but not perfect, there are third-party services being developed that are meant to kind of supercharge coding for people, which are just generally better. One of those was Windsurf, which has been kind of sniffed around by OpenAI, valued at kind of $3 billion. OpenAI has brokered a deal to purchase it. The deal is still going through, but that is the thing that I think is causing real issues. Because if you think about kind of Copilot that Microsoft has, it's kind of like a 21st century version of Clippy. And it is kind of a little bit like that in terms of the quality as well. Windsurf is kind of like what Microsoft wants an AI helper to be for coding. And so Microsoft wants to get its hands on Windsurf's IP. And OpenAI, kind of trying to consciously decouple from Microsoft, realizes that that is an issue because actually they don't want to give everything to Microsoft. They want to keep some stuff of their own. So it's around that access that we understand a lot of the challenges coming.
So what is OpenAI's kind of nuclear option in terms of the antitrust complaint against Microsoft?
They can go to the teacher and tell on OpenAI and Microsoft, basically. So they can say this is anti-competitive behavior. You're not allowed to do this. It kind of breaches the spirit of the agreement that we made all those years ago. Microsoft is tamping down innovation by trying to take all of our stuff and not allow us to talk to anybody else. That is super unfair. It's also really mean, and therefore they should not be allowed to do it. That is their argument.
Doesn't it feel like they just negotiated a bad deal early on?
Yeah, well, we have to remember, wind us back almost 10 years now, Yas. We talked about this. OpenAI, in a super kind of uncertain space, they were not a for-profit company. They probably had, pipe dreams of OpenAI becoming a kind of AI company that can benefit humanity for all of our lives. But actually, they thought that this AI revolution was like 30 years down the line. They didn't see ChatGPT being released as kind of a research preview and becoming the fastest growing service or app in history. And so they kind of made a deal as a junior power in this relationship, and then realized that actually we're equals, if not more. Maybe we actually hold the whip hand here. So yeah, it is a kind of recalculation and a bad deal. They want out of it. I'm not necessarily sure whether or not that would stand very well, and certainly accusing a partner of anti-competitive behavior could really come back to bite them.
Yeah, Chris, you talked in your story, which I edited, about the sort of risks of accusing Microsoft of anti-competitive behavior. Like there's this sort of boomerang effect some of the experts warned about. Can you explain that?
Yeah, there's basically just the fear that OpenAI could find the same issue. I mean, if you look at kind of the generative AI space, you could argue that OpenAI has a dominant position in that area. And, if we're looking at kind of anti-competitive, antitrust investigations, when you start to kind of sick the dogs on one company, there is a real risk, I suppose, that other people get caught up in that. And it could well be that actually OpenAI ended up like that because they are so dominant in this space. They're almost like the kind of becoming the generic term for AI. If you talk to your grandparents about AI, right, they're not talking about Gemini or Claude, they're talking about ChatGPT. And so I think that is the risk here, that actually this comes back to them almost as significantly and scuppers their business as well.
That's a funny point in the way that Google became analogous with search, right? You're going to Google something.
Yeah, and this is the really interesting thing, Max. There is, in the UK right now, on the day that we are speaking, an investigation opened by the Competition and Markets Authority, the UK's anti-competitive body overseeing this sort of stuff, which is saying they are looking at Google's dominance in the search industry. Like, if that's happening here with Google, frankly, 15 years after it should have, if they're wanting to think that this is a valid argument, who's to say that they won't turn around and do the same sort of thing with OpenAI now? It's kind of like, everybody's drawing guns on each other and trying to stare each other down. And it's the concern of who's going to pull the trigger first. And actually, does that then just set off kind of like a cascading thing that causes huge problems?
Well, Europe's been really aggressive in its antitrust pursuit of big tech, but also the US. I mean, I think we're still currently in trials around Meta, Google, and Apple right now by the current FTC.
Yeah, which, as someone who is technically not European since 2016, because a lot of my country mates made a really stupid decision, which is called Brexit. Many of you can listen to this, and if you're not understanding what that means, then please do Google it, or maybe ask Perplexity or another AI tool about it. But as someone sat kind of still in Europe in heart and spirit, if not literally in geography, I find that incredible that the US is kind of taking this action, because we had always thought that you would just kind of say, well, hands off. We're the country that has these companies that are growing. We like that. We don't want to ruin that. But it does seem like there is this kind of anti-tech sentiment that is growing across the world.
It's definitely the most significant since Microsoft in the 90s, that antitrust trial.
I want to talk a little bit about OpenAI's potential desire for restructuring because they need Microsoft's permission, effectively. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Remember, Microsoft owns 49% of the profit making of OpenAI. OpenAI, we talked about, they had moved from a non-profit initially to a cap profit organization. Sam Altman has dollar signs in his eyes, in his irises, in his one orb, whatever it is, WorldCoin thingamajig that he is doing. And I think he is seeing that this is too good an opportunity to turn down. So he is going, we desperately need to move to a profit-making basis. We need to really kind of crystallize the opportunity that we have here, because billions of dollars of investment from places like Microsoft is all well and good, but actually, we want to be making money of our own. The problem that they have is they don't want to hand over 49% of that to Microsoft. And so they are kind of trying to, I guess, divorce this company at the same time as saying, well, I want to keep the house, I want to keep the car, I want to keep the ponies, I also want to keep everything else that I have. So it is incredibly tricky, because part of the agreement says that Microsoft needs to grant permission for this to happen. But Microsoft aren't stupid. their executives realize what is happening here. And they go, we don't want to forego that 49% of profit that we get from OpenAI, probably going to be the 600-pound gorilla in the AI space. And so why on earth would we choose to do that? Why would we kind of consciously remove ourselves from that position of power and that position of making money?
Now, I want to talk a little bit to end this about AGI. How does that play into all this? It seems like Microsoft sort of has rights until AGI is reached, right?
They do, and that is part of the terms of the agreement that they brokered most recently, which I think was in 2023. The challenge with that is that AGI is such a contested term, and this is where things get super messy because...
I was just going to ask, do they define AGI in their contract?
Well, I don't think they do, as far as I'm aware. They may well do. I haven't looked at every single bit of the contract. I don't even know actually necessarily if it is out there. But the problem is that AGI by itself is not something that can be defined. We only need to look at, for instance, Elon Musk, who is in a kind of continual court battle over the last couple of years, also with OpenAI, to try and get them to stop their development of AI because he's worried about the point of reaching AGI, artificial general intelligence, and he wants a judge to decide when AGI is reached. The reality is that, OpenAI doesn't want that because, frankly, what would a judge know? Although, frankly, what does anybody in this industry know? We can't even settle on what artificial intelligence means, never mind what AGI means. So the sort of way I think that this plays out is that OpenAI desperately wants to get to AGI because it triggers that moment at which they can actually make that break from Microsoft. Microsoft desperately doesn't want to get to that point because they want to cling on to everything that they possibly can. The reality is, you could pull a pineapple out of your pocket and say this is AGI, and you could probably find someone who agrees with you on that definition because so many people have different viewpoints on what this means. So it's just super messy, and I don't really see how this works. We talked about, Europeans looking at the US and kind of the different idiosyncratic systems in our societies. As someone from the outside looking in, this is going to end up in a court case, right? Americans love lawsuits. Surely this is where this is going to go.
So what steps is OpenAI taking to distance itself from the partnership at the moment?
It is grabbing any other company that it possibly can and buddying up with them, yeah. So we have agreements with CoreWeave, we have agreements with Oracle. We mentioned, I think, also this tie-up with Google before, which is just quite so incredible because you ultimately had, for kind of the first 2.5 years of the generative AI revolution post-November 2022 and the release of ChatGPT, a kind of battle between two sides, right? You had OpenAI backed up by Microsoft. Microsoft was OpenAI's hype man, just like Max is mine. And you had on the other side Google, both of them trying to kind of compete to get AI supremacy. Now, what's happening now is you have the two partners splitting up, and you have one of the partners actually running over to the other side of the battlefield and saying, hey, you know what? Forget the last 2.5 years. I didn't like that guy anyway. Can I come and be friends with you? Now, that is out of expediency, right? I mean, that is simply that OpenAI, Sam Altman posted an image or reposted an image on X today of ChatGPT's new user downloads on, I think, the App Store. And they've added every day for the last month 1 million users, which is like crazy growth and unsustainable. And like he said, basically, he's very grateful that, his staff have been in a 2.5-year sprint and continue to be in a 2.5-year sprint. And I think that he is looking at this and seeing, well, this continues to go up and to the right in terms of its growth. We have a current ceiling on our compute that we are going to rapidly reach, not least as these models get more powerful, as people throw more tokens at them, as they demand more exacting tasks from them. So we desperately need to get that compute. So they are going to try and find that from any place that they possibly can.
Now, real last question. We know what's best for OpenAI. We kind of know what's best for Microsoft, sort of. What do you think is best for consumers?
That's a really difficult question to answer. I can start by saying what I think isn't best for consumers. What isn't best for consumers, I think, is OpenAI getting away with it again. And I am a tech skeptic, tech reporter, full disclosure. I think that is part of the job that you have to have nowadays. It's what makes you kind of decent in terms of not necessarily agreeing with the motives or being quite skeptical of what these folks are doing. But Sam Altman has managed to do some pretty incredible things over the last few years. He's managed to survive a boardroom coup over serious concerns about the future direction of his company and to come back even stronger.
Tell you what, I would never enter a partnership with that man. I mean, not that I would ever be presented with that opportunity, but...
Well, you said it. And I think the challenge here is if he manages to get out of a contract with, arguably up until kind of the social media era, the biggest tech company in the world, and manages to kind of knock them down and say, actually, you know what, we don't need you anymore and we can kind of ignore the terms of our agreement. That's massive. And that also kind of encourages more potentially risky behavior in that way. And if AI is as fundamental and as important a technology as many people say it is, including, by the way, people within OpenAI or people who used to work at OpenAI, then that becomes a big issue. So Sam Altman doesn't need a big ego boost, I think. He certainly doesn't need another one. I do think that better outcome for users, for all of us, would actually be a Microsoft kind of win here for this partnership to continue, because I think Microsoft kind of keeps OpenAI a little bit in check. And I also think that you have to bear in mind that we are, in discussing this kind of inside baseball stuff, at the kind of bleeding edge of this stuff. And we have to remember we're not normal. God knows none of us are normal. We are kind of like the super users of this. And the reality is that most people's interactions with AI now and in the near future will be with Copilot. It'll be the Clippy stuff rather than the kind of supercharged AI models. And so if there is this break between OpenAI and Microsoft, what does Microsoft replace OpenAI tech in its back end with? Like, do we have hundreds of millions of users who we're saying AI is going to be a transformative technology to you, ending up having to use kind of a reworked version of Clippy that Microsoft found down the back of their stationery cupboard or something like that? Like, we want them to have the best possible technology, and the best possible technology, the strongest models at the minute that are kind of general purpose, are OpenAI's. So I think that's important for the users, and I think that is kind of the best possible outcome. I think it's one that Sam Altman doesn't want, but I think actually might be best not just for users, but also for OpenAI as well.
We'll be back with Chris and Max for keeping tabs, but first we're going to take a quick break, followed by our interview with Jon Gluck.
As affordable, reliable energy demand increases at historic rates, one company is uniquely positioned to accelerate America forward: Williams. We have 117 years of know-how in powering progress, and we're ready to power the next 100 years of innovation. Learn how our natural gas infrastructure is critical to the future of AI at williams.com.
Our colleague, Fast Company senior editor Jon Gluck, wrote a memoir. The book is called An Exercise in Uncertainty, a Memoir of Illness and Hope, and it tells the story of his battle with multiple myeloma, a rare and incurable blood cancer. He was told in his late 30s that he had 18 months to live, but that was actually 20 years ago. So we get into Jon's family life, what role work has played in his treatment, the myriad treatments he's been through, and what the term cancer zombie means.
And as a reminder, if you like this interview, you can hear and see more of it in a YouTube-exclusive extended cut. Just go to Fast Company's YouTube channel.
Now, here's the interview. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And your book came out this week.
Comes out tomorrow, Tuesday, June 10th.
Oh my God, congratulations. How are you feeling about it?
Super excited and equally super terrified.
Yeah, that sounds about right. We talked about this a little bit in the intro, but I think to sort of table stakes, what is the illness you have?
Yeah, I have a blood cancer, alternately referred to sometimes as a bone marrow cancer. either term is acceptable, called multiple myeloma. Not to be confused with the skin cancer known as melanoma, which many people do confuse it with, but it's a incurable cancer, but one that has fortunately, in my case, been treatable, meaning I will never not have it. But fortunately, I've been in a position where my doctors have been able to manage and control it quite nicely. There have been times where I've been very sick, and then I'm treated, and I go into a remission, and then I'm sick again, and I go into a remission, and that's been kind of the story of the last 20 years.
And a portion of your book proceeds are going towards multiple myeloma research, right?
Yes, yeah. I feel super committed to that and feel like it's something that's tremendously important, especially in the environment we're in with biomedical research under threat. It's really important to me that we do what we can for that cause.
After your initial diagnosis, when I think at the time you were given, 2 years maybe, the first person you called or the first thing you did was call into work. Why?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one I didn't realize, obviously, at first why, but I've had time to think about it now. And I think a couple reasons. One, I think I was trying to create a sense of normalcy for myself, as in like, oh, big deal. So I'm sick today. I'll just call in sick and, like I have a sniffle or something. And I think that was part of it. I think part of it was denial. I just didn't want to really admit that anything was so wrong that I had to do anything differently than I normally would. And I think part of it was just the strange sense of dutifulness I have sometimes as an individual. I was like, well, I better report to the boss that, I won't be there today, even though I've now just received life-changing information.
It's very honor student behavior.
Yeah, I don't know about the honor student part. Maybe good Boy Scout, something like that. Yeah. But yeah, that's what I did. I was also avoiding calling the people who I knew it would be a much bigger deal.
Yeah, it makes it real.
I was really impressed by the fact that you then called your therapist and set up an appointment. Like, that is like real, it's not planning, but it's very smart.
Yeah, I think that was like inching my way along the same spectrum we were just talking about, and I think there were a couple reasons for that. One, again, all the things I said before, I wasn't quite ready to tell my friends or my family, let alone my wife. And it occurred to me, luckily, I guess, that my therapist was sort of the perfect person to talk to first. I had been seeing her for a number of years, so we knew each other well. She knew me and my story very well. And she was also professionally trained to handle something like that. And so that was kind of my interim step between total denial and like getting to a position where I was ready to tell other people. And she very kindly said, of course, come right away and I'll cancel my other appointments and see you. And it was, I was very fortunate that way.
You mentioned this in the book, right? Which is, you sort of have 3 buckets of response people have to your diagnosis. And the first is like, I actually know someone who died from that, which is horrible.
Yeah.
The second is, this is a bucket I fall into, which is bad, but somebody being like, I'm going to help you. Like, here's the number for 5 doctors, and here's what you should do, and are you doing X, Y, Z? And then there's the third, which is somebody who's just able to kind of listen to you and be empathetic and say, that sucks. But what kind of advice do you have for someone who's like responding to, this kind of thing in your life?
Totally. It's a tricky thing, most everybody is well-intentioned, and so whatever people say or do, I understand typically. That said, I'm going to give a never, sometimes, always answer to your 3 buckets. So, the never is, boy, I just knew somebody who had that and they died yesterday. Or I was just, I'm going to give that a never. I think it's pretty unhelpful. As sympathetic as I am, I'm sure that person's situation is very painful. Probably the person who just told you they've been diagnosed with the same disease is not the best person to talk to about that. The sometimes, I think wanting to help, again, completely understand the impulse. And I've been on the other side of this myself, so I get it. It's complicated. I'd say the criteria I'd use there after 20 years of dealing with this is, are you offering something that's genuinely helpful and that the person probably hasn't already heard before?
Yeah.
And I think if you are, then yeah, go for it. I think, there have been people who I know who said, listen, I happen to know my wife's aunt's cousin's uncle is really close friends with an amazing myeloma doctor at such and such a hospital. If you ever want to reach out to them, I can put you in touch. That's helpful. And then the always category is just, like you say, basic empathy or sympathy. I've been really struck over the years by how powerful just somebody simply saying, I'm really sorry to hear that. Honest to God, those words alone are wonderful, and more powerful than you think they are. One of the first people I told in my office, a colleague I remember very vividly, simply said, you poor guy, I'm really sorry. And that was so moving. And it wasn't even someone I was particularly close with. It was just somebody who knew the right thing to say.
Yeah. I think there is sometimes a fourth bucket. And I found this with my parents when I had a much less serious experience with cancer than you did. The hardest conversation I had was with my parents because I felt the need to comfort them because your child going through something. I was 30 at the time when I was diagnosed and they were distraught. And so then I found myself having to comfort them. What was the hardest conversation to have? You talk about your wife extensively in the book as well, but beyond Dee Dee, was there someone who was more difficult to have a conversation with?
Yeah, first, I'm sorry you went through this as well. And there's no such thing as an unserious cancer diagnosis. So,
mine was a very silly version.
Okay, yeah, no need to compare.
Josh faked his cancer.
Okay.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're certainly going to make news with this podcast then, yeah. The toughest...
Yeah, it gets me canceled.
I've been trying.
I would say I guess I'll give you two answers. One is Dee Dee was the toughest. It's like we'd only been married a handful of years. Just as importantly, if not more so, we had a 7-month-old daughter, our first child, and that was brutal. And interestingly enough, Dee Dee, my wife, her father had passed away when she was quite young, unexpectedly, of a heart attack. And she was strangely calm, I think in part because she'd been through something like this before, which on the one hand, I tremendously appreciated for all the reasons you're saying. I didn't then feel like I had the extra emotional burden of needing to handle her upset. On the other hand, over the years, that became problematic sometimes because you also, to some degree, sort of want the other person to freak out,
Yeah.
And, it's like, if you don't freak out, do you not care? And these are some of the complicated emotional gymnastics you wind up doing in spite of yourself with a diagnosis like this. And then after that, I would say, Josh, I'm 1,000% with you. It was my parents. That was absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
Because I knew how badly it would sting for them. And they were great too. They were troopers. But it definitely had... I write in the book that cancer is a nuclear bomb, not a tactical weapon, in the sense that it has fallout across all areas of your life. And it certainly had fallout for everyone involved. But, my parents, it was tough. I've subsequently found out more of their honest reaction from other people, my brothers and sisters and family friends. And, that was rough.
Yeah.
In the book, you shared that while many people, when they get a diagnosis like this, rethink their whole lives, you actually look back on your life and you were like, I'm pretty happy with my job and my situation and where I'm living. And I guess I'm curious, how has work kind of helped you? You've been working this whole time.
Yeah, a handful of things about that. One is I have been working this whole time. I've hardly missed a day of work, even when I've been hospitalized because of remote work now and Zooming. I just turn my background off and go about my business. And sometimes people say, that's so brave or courageous or wonderful of you to have worked the whole time. Believe me, it has nothing to do with bravery. In my case, it just sheerly is an incredibly great distraction. And, pressure and deadlines and all these things we deal with in our business, they were great for me because it was like, okay, whatever the problem is here at work, it's not as big as that problem, And people, of course, often talk about getting that kind of perspective when they've received a diagnosis like mine. And that's absolutely been true in my case. The other thing, as you talked about, Yaz, I really came to see that I love what I do. And so there was just pleasure and enjoyment in doing the work. And, when you're sick and not feeling well all the time or getting treatment and feeling even worse, pleasure and enjoyment are in short supply. So that was another part of it. And yeah, it just became a refuge in a way from cancer.
You can still get burned out, though. You talk about leaving your magazine at some point because you were like, this is really fun. I need a break.
Yeah. I mean, I happened to be working at a place that was extremely demanding, and I had been there for more than 10 years. And as my disease became more complicated and my treatment became more aggressive and the side effects, therefore, were more debilitating, even back at the beginning of my diagnosis, so many people said to me, family and friends, well-meaning people, oh, gosh, you really want to work this hard? Stress is bad for you and all that. And I was like, well, stress is bad for you if it's bad stress. Or if it's an excessive level of stress. But as I was saying a minute ago, a certain amount of stress I found really good in the sense that it kept my mind off of my illness. But that reached a tipping point somewhere in my 10th year of working where I was working. And I realized I need a job that's not so demanding minute to minute, day to day.
You also talked about basically, there's a lot of layoffs that happen in media overall, and insurance, employer-based insurance is so crucial, and especially crucial for you to have. So you sort of needed to be ahead of the curve on that, even if it was out of an abundance of caution. You talk a little bit about the insurance battles that you've had, because it's never easy. Anyone
the life insurance one was crazy.
Oh my God, yeah.
So, yeah, I'll start by saying that an interesting thing that I kind of represent in a strange way, or I've become an example of, an unwilling example of, is what I call this new category of people I call cancer zombies. And what I mean by that is not people who are half dead and half alive, but people who are half sick and half well. And there are a growing number of us because of the advancements in biomedical research and the treatments for many kinds of cancers. Not all cancers, but many. So instead of either you're treated and you survive and you're good to go for the rest of your life, or you're treated and unfortunately the treatments don't work and you pass away, there's this whole cohort of us who are living for really long periods of time with varying degrees of illness and debilitation. Where I'm going with all that is, unless you're independently wealthy, and I'm not, that means you therefore need to work for a lot of years, and you need insurance for a lot of years, even while you're struggling with your illness and your treatments. So yes, that was super important to me. And I had sort of caught wind that the place I was working was getting ready to do some layoffs, some substantial layoffs. And I realized, as you say, Josh, perfectly, like I needed to try and stay ahead of that curve. A, because I was burnt out at the job I was in anyway, but B, I couldn't afford to be without health insurance. And it turns out something I learned in the book is that the leading cause of personal bankruptcy is unexpected medical expenses. Because of all that, we felt like we really needed a sort of belt and suspenders approach and for both of us to have insurance in case either of us got laid off, because we were both in the media business and layoffs have been happening, as we all know, for many years now at an alarming rate. So there was that. In terms of dealing with insurance companies and the life insurance anecdote I talk about in the book, it's maddening. One of the things I realized in thinking about this is there's this whole complex bureaucracy we all know about and how frustrating it can be to deal with prior authorizations and mishandled claims. And what I've realized is the system is so broken that what it comes down to is just getting lucky. And what I mean by that is getting somebody on the other end of the phone, A, who will pick up the phone, B, who's a human being, not a machine, and C, who actually, and this is the important part, cares and wants to help solve your problem. Whether that happens or not is just a crapshoot. It's happened for me a handful of times and many times it hasn't. And then you just have to keep going at it. The life insurance thing is they just blindsided us with I'm sorry, we're not offering this type of policy anymore. And they wiggled through some loophole where they could offer us an alternative. But the alternative was 4 times as expensive for 1/4 the coverage. And yeah, that's sort of the state of the American insurance industry.
The other thing that is in the book and that I only realized when I got sick, and Josh, maybe you realize, is how much you have to advocate for yourself in terms of like finding the right doctors. And
yeah, it's unbelievable. Mainly when you're in the medical system, you're at your worst, right? You're not feeling well, you're anxious. And then they put this extra burden on you. In fact, patient burden, that term is something that people talk about a lot in the world of complex diseases because it's just been going up and up. Patient portals push more of the administrative tasks onto you. Insurance companies under profit pressure are making it more and more difficult to, as we just talked about, maneuver their systems. Doctors' offices, a lot of private practices this has been written about a great deal, bought up by private equity and other for-profit entities, hospitals as well. And in turn, they put more profit pressure on these offices, which part of the downstream effect from that is then the doctor's offices and the hospitals put more of the burden on you to handle all of the administrative tasks. So yeah, it's a lot of work and, just another of the things that you're forced to deal with when you least want to.
What was the pandemic like for you?
That was tough. Part of both my illness and my treatment have left me quite immunocompromised. And it was tough for everybody and possibly even scarier for those of us who felt like we didn't have much defense against this at all if we were to get it.
And you were in the city, right?
We were in the city. We had no other logical place to go. We didn't want to move in with family and expose them to extra risk. Everyone was trying to keep their bubbles small, and we don't have a second home or someplace we could go to. So we stayed here. We followed all the precautions pretty much to a T. But then, oddly enough, we went back to living the way most people were living then. We wore masks in crowded public places and in the supermarket, and we tried to avoid going to stores too often. But at some point, I just decided, what's the point of staying alive if you don't live your life? So I didn't make myself a complete shut-in.
Yeah.
I tried to be sensible, but also live my life. One of the interesting things that happened toward the end of the first most serious wave of the pandemic is I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post. The title was something like, it's great that everybody's getting back to normal now. Please keep in mind that there are some of us who are immunocompromised who still need to take these precautions. And most of the comments I got were lovely and supportive, as you might imagine. But then, of course, what I thought was a relatively benign and sort of maybe even kind, I'll go so far as to say, thing to say, was met with not that response by, some people who, one of the comments I think was, that's the luck of the draw. We don't owe you anything. Stop whining, or words to that effect.
So crazy.
And so, that was not the most pleasant part of my pandemic experience, but here we are.
Yeah, you really saw the worst, the worst of people.
Well, you talked about it like an IRL experience on your way to, I think you were in middle of CAR-T experience in the pickup truck story on the highway where you actually confronted someone who said, I'll let you tell the story. I mean, so you sort of like lost it a little bit there, right? How much was that building up, and can you tell that story?
I mean, you put your finger right on it. It's like I did sort of implode or explode, I guess.
We're all justified reasons.
I can't imagine you getting angry.
Well, that's the funny thing.
What it's worth.
It was out of character, and yet it's a testament to, how difficult some of this stuff is to cope with, that no matter how even-keeled you think you are or you normally are in your day-to-day life, something like this eventually is going to get to you, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to boil over. So I was on my way home from literally, I had just received a chemotherapy treatment. I was in a cab on my way home in downtown Manhattan. There was tremendous traffic because there was a parade that day, it turned out. And we were literally inching our way along, at times just fully parked. And coincidentally, a pickup truck pulled up alongside me. I was in the back seat on the right side of the cab, and I had the window down, and I was masked because I was trying to, be as safe as possible COVID-wise, and especially because I was particularly compromised at that point. And this truck pulled up right alongside, and the driver looked at me, and he was straight out of central casting, sort of looked like, I guess, somebody who maybe was predisposed to this sort of opinion, and looked at me and said, and he had his buddy, his wingman, sitting next to him, and looked at me and he said, mind you, I'm a perfect stranger. He doesn't know me from anyone. And he said, lose the mask. And I was like, I took a beat, and then I was like, you know what? This is a family podcast, so I have...
No, it's not.
I have had it, So because we were all but stopped in the traffic, I literally got out of the cab, took the 2 or 3 steps over to his rolled down window, and at that point I could see it started to turn in his head what was going on, because I was almost completely bald. I had a wrap around my arm with an IV that was, permanently inserted. And I just said to him, buddy, I'm on my way home from chemotherapy. This is in preparation for a 3-week hospital stay that I'm starting tomorrow, all of which was true. The reason I'm wearing the mask is because I have cancer, and bleep you. And number one, I'm just going to say it felt really good. It was like 20 years of buildup, just, of not overreacting, or even, really expressing too much anger at all, just kind of came pouring out of me.
Yeah.
Two, in fairness, I will say, I have a friend who calls me Mr. Reasonable, so you're right about that. And now here comes Mr. Reasonable coming back. I will say the second he put it all together, he was incredibly sorry. He wasn't like a horrible guy. He was just kind of a low-key jerk.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm so sorry. I obviously didn't know. I'm really, really sorry. Really, really sorry. He kept apologizing. And then funny enough, at the next light, they turned right. And I think they were probably going to keep going. He just didn't want to keep inching along side by side with me and having to
At that point,
see
you
me.
got to be like, I got to.
Yeah, he wanted out.
Yeah.
So that was my temper tantrum.
So I guess my last question related to workplace stuff is, how important are accommodations like the ability to work remotely for you?
Yeah, it's been tremendously important. One of the other things that is interesting about the pandemic, which you were asking about a minute ago, is so I had been living like that on and off for many years. And then in some ways it was like, our pickup truck friend aside, many, if not most people, sort of sympathize more with everybody who has ever been through this and has to worry constantly about germs, And so that was sort of normalizing in a strange way. But the best part was being able to work remotely. It allowed me to keep my job without going on disability. It allowed me to, as I say, keep this constant distraction of working in place so that I didn't lose my mind. And it became kind of a lifeline.
How worried have you been, if you started new jobs, and you mentioned some of this in the book when it came to your time at Hearst, about workplace discrimination?
Yeah, it's a really tricky question. I'm not the kind of person to sort of knee-jerk, see that sort of thing everywhere. But I've seen it. I've had glimpses of it. I'd say a couple things come to mind. When I was getting ready to leave New York Magazine and interviewing for jobs at other places, a recruiter said to me, "Oh, I read the story you wrote in New York Magazine. How are you doing?" Because many years earlier, I had written a short essay about my original diagnosis in the first couple of years of my illness. On the one hand, she seemed like an extremely nice person, and, I'm the kind of person who's inclined to give people the benefit of the doubt. So I thought she was sincere in her question, but I also wondered, is she fishing for information about my health status so she can figure out if I'm hireable or a wise hire or not,
Right.
I'll never know, but that's one of the things that when you're in my position, you wonder about and you have to worry about. That said, it is a major, serious issue for a lot of people. I'm not here to, again, give people advice or say whether or not you should share information about your illness if you receive a diagnosis like this. I will say, once you do decide to, there's no putting it back in the bottle. So just be super sure that if you want to share this information, you are potentially opening yourself up to what can be a very serious problem.
Last question. I'm curious how you set yourself up for success as you've navigated things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, some of it honestly is luck. I'm not saying that to be falsely humble. I think, I've been lucky enough to be able to work this whole time, and there are a lot of people who have what I have or other cancers or other illnesses or other problems of any sort who aren't. So, there's some Yogi Berra-ism, I don't remember it, about just showing up or 99% of, what I'm talking about. So I've been able to show up. That counts for a lot. Beyond that, I would say some of the common things we write about at Fast Company all the time, like I'm a pretty good networker and I've built, I think, a good network of people who've been able to help me find jobs when I've needed to find jobs. Another thing is, I try and do a good job. I work pretty hard, and I try and be nice to people. And I'm sure there have been lots of people I haven't been nice to. And there are days where I don't work that hard. But all in all, I try to play by the rules and hope that things will, of course, I'm not naive. They don't always work out for you when you do that. But I think it gives you a better chance if you do that than if you don't.
Not being a jerk usually
is good. That's a start anyway. And then I think two other quick things. One, I mentioned I really love what I do. And so pretty much everywhere I've been, I think that shines through. I hope it does anyway, and kind of lights a fire under me in a good way. And then last is, I hate to give cancer credit for anything good, but I do think some of those things I was talking about before, about the perspective it gives you, it is pretty tough to throw me in the workplace. So I'm good in a high pressure situation. I'm good in an intense, big project that's like, wow, we're going to have to climb Mount Everest to get this done. It's like, dude, this is not Mount Everest. This is like a molehill and we're all going to be fine. We're going to totally make this work. And I think people respond to that. And I think it helps keep me more calm and productive in the workplace. And I think maybe the people I work with have felt that way too. A few of them have told me so anyway.
Well, this was great, Jon. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed it and really appreciate it.
And we can buy your book anywhere?
Anywhere, Audible, Kindle, hardcover.
Did you read it?
I have not actually reread the hardcover, yeah.
Oh, I mean for the Audible recording.
Yes, I read it for the Audible recording. It was a terrifying experience on the one hand. And on the other hand, it was sort of fun because you're in a recording studio that's similar to this one, but even more sort of rock star-ish. And so It's the closest I'm ever going to come to being Bono. And, I drank it in for those 3 or 4 days. Yeah.
Okay, we are back, and it's time to wrap up the show with Keeping Tabs. This is where each one of us shares a story, a trend, or a piece of pop culture we're following right now. And Chris, let's start with you. What are you keeping tabs on?
I have just finished a marathon documentary series, which I think will be available on some streaming service in the US, although I admit probably isn't right now, called Shifty. It's by a documentarian called Adam Curtis. He basically creates these ridiculous kind of art house, but also very accessible documentaries that kind of skewer power and all of the issues around politics using kind of found footage from old news broadcasts and stuff. This makes it sound way more kind of pretentious than it actually is. It's Adam Curtis is kind of like a very mainstream filmmaker in the UK, but he's basically looked at the last 30 years of society and done this kind of 6 hours of footage that is in 5 episodes that I've just watched basically every single evening after doing some work. And it is really good. So keep an eye out for it wherever it appears on your streaming services.
It's like Ken Burns meets Sacha Baron Cohen.
Exactly. Precisely. You got into one.
I love that you added after doing work because your editor's on this call.
He is. Sometimes during work because we have a time difference, which is always very fun.
Max, what are you keeping tabs on?
I am keeping tabs on the robotaxi rollout here in sunny Austin, Texas.
Ooh.
Have you been in one yet?
No, I think there's so far only, it's a sort of limited rollout, and I think it's been a lot of influencers to date. I don't think they've...
Because they're not asking questions about what the button is on the car door. That's why, Max.
Wait, there's influencers in Austin, Texas?
Oh. Wait, was that sarcastic? Yes.
I know you called one and set it on fire.
I knew you were going to make that joke.
Can neither confirm nor deny.
Max on top of a burning Waymo with a skateboard.
It is funny because it reminds me, we talked...
It'd be a longboard, though.
We talked on the podcast, oh man, maybe it was 2 months ago, about Elon and Tesla. This is when Elon was still at Doge. And I think one of the takeaways was people have a very short memory, and probably Tesla will be fine if Elon's back at the helm. And Tesla stock is still not great, but I mean, shares saw an 8% spike on Monday.
You're I just want you to know that I was right.
I'm not saying... I'm not
You're
saying...
not right.
I guess my point is I don't know. Again, people are making fun of the robotaxi and Elon, and the font is pretty stupid, but I feel like this thing's probably just going to blow up. Not literally, not like a Waymo. I'm saying it'll
Poor choice of words.
Yeah, exactly. So there were these videos that were already shared online where the robotaxi was driving the wrong way down the road and braking hard in the middle of traffic. I mean,
oh no.
And then the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said that it's in contact with Tesla and is trying to gather information, which I'm sure Tesla's going to not be super forthcoming about.
My dumb take is that robotaxis aren't actually going to take off because people secretly want dangerous drivers because they want to get where they're going faster.
What?
And these taxis follow the law. They go the speed limit. They go all of these things. They're slower going. I think people really want a driver who goes 40 and a 25. That's what they want.
I feel like 3 of us have really incriminated ourselves on this call.
Yeah. Only one coming out of this podcast looking good is Chris.
I have to potentially get across the border at some point.
Judge, what are you keeping tabs on?
I'm keeping tabs on something called Slam Frank the Musical. This is going to be really deep inside the alt theater community scene. Okay, so let me set the table. This started as a bit by this guy on TikTok that was basically making fun of Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton, where he started making songs for something he was calling Slam Frank the Musical that recast Anne Frank in a more diverse way as a non-binary Hispanic person. So the point of this was basically to be a send-up of Hamilton and also a send-up of like hypocritical tokenizing. No, I mean, it comes off to people who don't know the second part of this as pretty racist, but there was this conversation a few years ago in the theater community about authenticity in casting, because basically like there was a lot of basically like tokenized casting of things, and there was this production of Funny Girl on Broadway. It starred Beanie Feldstein and then Leah Michele, but then it went on tour like a lot of Broadway shows do, and they recast it, and there was like this announcement of who was going to play Fanny Bryce, and it was a Cuban-American actress, a non-Jewish actress. That sort of like the posting very much like college diversity program was like, we cast this Cuban-American actress as this, and so the Broadway community and the theater community kind of blew up of like, well, if we look for authenticity of casting, you wouldn't do this with like a black character, a Hispanic character. We've had these conversations before. Why are we casting non-Jewish actors in Jewish roles, especially something like Fanny Bryce over there? All of that is to say, this musical is a 2-hour show based on a TikTok bit that was mildly funny, lampooning basically those two things, Hamilton and this conversation. Alt theater scene's gone too far. We need to stop this. It was a bit.
I'll be honest, never going to see this.
No, it's at the Asylum Theater in New York. Why did you spend your time writing a whole show on this? It was an okay TikTok bit. Gotta stop doing this shit. Don't spend your time making a 2-hour show. And I've like seen clips of it, and it's just not very funny. It's just like, oh, ho, ho, ho. It's a funny premise. And then the actual stuff is like, just kind of painful. I'm just like, oh, God, you're not Trey Parker and Matt Stone. Please stop doing this. Stop doing this, everybody.
Now, how alt is the alt theater in question?
Well, I think the guy in question who wrote it has worked with Star Kid Productions, which is like a parody musical theater company based in LA. They did like the Harry Potter musical back in the day. And it's taking place at the Asylum Theater, which is a rat-infested basement theater in New York, like many of them are. It's a real shithole, but it's also where Titanic started. So it is kind of in question like a theater known for the sort of ridiculous alt comedy musical theater scene. So, I mean, pretty alt, but please stop. Please stop doing this. Anyways, that's my gripe from the musical theater world of the week. Yaz, what are you keeping tabs on?
Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez's wedding is upon us, and
speaking of alt musical theater.
Yeah.
Well, they just did their opening celebration, and it was it was a foam party on Bezos' $500 million yacht.
Oh my God, the foam parties. What is the deal with foam parties?
I thought they were so cool in high school, but they're actually disgusting.
They're disgusting.
Yeah. Max is like, I don't know.
I kind of see it. No.
But I love the idea of, you know, all of these powerful people attending a foam party. And Bezos is despicable in many ways. His wedding is going to cost $10 million. It's taken over Venice. But I find still something oddly charming about this awful couple because they're just really into each other and they're kind of lame.
He kind of won me over with the mermaid statue. I don't know. It's like he's really into her. It's
That's what I mean. It's hard not to kind of.
Yeah.
I'm like, you guys are huge dorks.
But then he does stuff like arrange a phone party, which presumably is just that you can have many photos of him with his shirt off, right?
Yeah, 100%. Oh, the paparazzi photos are already out, and they both look very good, to be honest.
Yeah, his glow up, I think, is fairly acceptable. I think his glow up stopped at the right place. I think the Mark Zuckerberg glow up went too far. Like, he was looking good for a little while, and then he's like, whatever stylist he's working with, this has got to stop.
I feel like Jeff Bezos kind of just wore like Patagonia vests, which is, I mean, honestly, for a guy his age, checks out. And Mark Zuckerberg looked like a teenager on Coney Island or something.
Oh my God, yeah.
But I will say, Jeff Bezos has had some. He's hired a very good injector. His face is looking more symmetrical than ever.
I mean, billionaire glow-ups can do things. So poor Mark Andreessen can only do so much to get rid of that forehead.
What if one day he showed up with a toupee, though?
Oh my God, Mark Andreessen! It would look like putting a fucking like rug on top of Humpty Dumpty.
No, it would look like putting a wig on a traffic cone.
Yeah, that's it. That nails it. We're gonna get sued. We're gonna get sued for defamation by Mark Andreessen.
And that's it for Most Innovative Companies. Our show is produced by Avery Miles and Blake Odom with help from Sam Gebauer and Hawa Atori. Editing by Matt Toder, mix and sound design by Tad Wadhams and Nicholas Torres. Our executive producer is Josh Christensen. Remember again to subscribe, rate, and review, and we'll see you next week.